Picture this scenario. Tomorrow, you wake up and there is no job waiting for you, no money system in place, no boss to answer to, and not even the idea of Monday exists anymore. There's no alarm clock going off, no inbox to check, no meeting scheduled, nobody asking you to follow up later or hop on a call. So, what would you actually do with yourself? If your gut reaction is that you'd finally feel liberated, you're in good company, because that's essentially the same reaction every single human had for roughly 300,000 years. For the vast majority of our species' existence, this scenario wasn't hypothetical at all. It was just an ordinary day, maybe a Tuesday, except there was no such thing as Tuesday, or any day of the week for that matter. The whole idea of chopping time into 7-day cycles, arranged so you spend 5 of them dreading work and barely 2 of them enjoying yourself, is actually a fairly modern invention, and it's arguably not one of our better ones. This raises a question worth sitting with. What did prehistoric people fill their time with, hour after hour, from sunrise to sunset, when there was no job, no streaming service, no phone to scroll through, and no subscriptions to cancel? What did an average day actually look like for someone living in that era? The truth turns out to be surprising, fascinating, and honestly a bit humbling for us modern people, because it seems that people history books once dismissed as primitive were, in several meaningful ways, living lives that were arguably richer than many of ours today. But this isn't an exaggeration for effect. It's simply where the evidence leads once you actually examine it closely. So, let's dig in. One of the most persistent myths about prehistoric existence is that it was essentially a constant fight for survival, like some brutal video game on repeat. Wake up, avoid being eaten, grunt at things, fail to discover farming, die around age 30. That picture is almost entirely inaccurate, and the reason it took hold is actually somewhat understandable. We looked at physical evidence such as bones bearing, cut marks, weapons, and the remains of butchered animals, and concluded that life must have been non-stop brutal struggle. But that's only part of the picture. We also discovered cave paintings, musical instruments carved from bird bones and mammoth ivory dating back 40,000 years, and jewelry crafted from shells, teeth, and carefully drilled stone beads strung into necklaces. We've uncovered proof that people traveled hundreds of miles on foot, without roads, maps, or any modern transportation, purely to trade pigments used for body decoration. We've found burial sites where elderly individuals who had lived for decades despite severe physical disabilities were laid to rest with visible care and ceremony, sometimes even surrounded by flowers. None of this fits the image of a species locked in constant survival panic. Instead, it points to people who had considerable free time and chose to spend it on genuinely meaningful pursuits. The narrative of constant survival horror isn't just wrong, it's nearly the reverse of what actually happened. Back in the 1960s, anthropologist Marshall Solins took an approach that was seen as fairly unconventional for its time. He conducted careful research into how contemporary hunter-gatherer societies actually spent their time, hoping to get a sense of what daily existence might have resembled before farming reshaped human life entirely. His research covered groups like the Kung San in southern Africa's Kalahari Desert, the Hadzabe in Tanzania, and various Aboriginal communities in Australia, all groups that had preserved elements of a hunter-gatherer way of living well into modern times. What he uncovered essentially dismantled the prevailing assumptions. On average, these communities devoted somewhere between 3 and 5 hours daily to what could be classified as subsistence activities, things like hunting, gathering food, maintaining tools, and building or repairing shelter. That's it, 3 to 5 hours. Everything else was genuinely free time, spent talking, resting, sleeping, playing, creating music and art, crafting tools they didn't urgently need, and telling stories woven into the intricate social fabric of group life. Solins referred to hunter-gatherers as the original affluent society, not because of material wealth, since they owned very little by deliberate choice, given that everything you possess is something you must carry, but because they possessed the one resource modern humans constantly chase and rarely manage to obtain, an abundance of unstructured, unpaid, genuinely free time. Compare this to today's typical adult, who, between commuting, working, handling errands, managing childcare, and dealing with the general grind of contemporary life, ends up with roughly 2.5 to 3 hours of actual leisure time daily, assuming things go well. And a large chunk of that time gets consumed staring at screens, absorbing content specifically engineered to keep viewers anxious enough to stay engaged. In other words, we're working longer hours, under more stress, with less genuine rest, than people who hunted wild animals armed with sticks. Take a moment to really consider that. Let's examine this more closely, because the details here are genuinely remarkable. Ancient people were constant, skilled conversationalists. If you traveled back in time and watched a group of hunter-gatherers gathered around a fire in the late afternoon, what would stand out most wouldn't be the flames, the animal hides, the stone tools, or the lack of internet access. It would be how much they talked. These were people deeply committed to conversation as a regular practice. Research studying modern hunter-gatherer societies has repeatedly found that a substantial share of their non-working hours, possibly 60 to 70% of all social interaction, was devoted purely to talking. And this wasn't limited to practical discussions about animal migration patterns or river conditions. They gossiped, joked around, argued, flirted, complained about one another, retold old stories, and speculated about mysteries they couldn't explain. British anthropologist Robin Dunbar, known for what's called Dunbar's number, the theory suggesting humans can maintain roughly 150 stable relationships before it becomes cognitively overwhelming, made a compelling argument that language itself likely evolved primarily as a social bonding tool. Other primates maintain their social connections through physical grooming, picking debris and parasites out of each other's fur, which is a slow, intimate process that builds trust between individuals. But as human groups expanded and grew more complex, physically grooming everyone in the group became impossible. There simply weren't enough hours in the day. So language developed to serve that same bonding purpose, but at a much larger scale. You can verbally connect with several people simultaneously, meaning that sitting around a fire, chatting with 5 people, maintains 5 relationships in roughly the same time it would take to physically groom just one. Under this framework, gossip isn't some negative personality trait. It's actually humanity's original social technology, the fundamental mechanism underlying human community. Which means every time you call a friend just to chat about nothing important, or trade gossip with a coworker, or spend an evening simply talking and laughing with people you care about, you're engaging in essentially the same behavior your ancestors practiced around fires 50,000 years ago. You're not wasting time. You're participating in one of humanity's oldest and most fundamental activities. Here's a fact that tends to surprise people. The idea of sleeping straight through 8 uninterrupted hours each night is likely a fairly recent development, not something humans naturally evolved to do or historically practiced. It's essentially something we were pushed into by artificial lighting and industrial work schedules. Historian Roger Ekirch dedicated over 20 years to studying historical sleep patterns using diaries, medical records, court documents, and literary sources, and discovered strong evidence that before artificial lighting became widespread, most people slept in 2 separate segments. There was a first sleep period starting around dusk and lasting until roughly midnight, followed by a natural waking period lasting 1 to 2 hours, which wasn't insomnia, but simply normal wakefulness, and then a second sleep period continuing until dawn. During that middle stretch of wakefulness, people weren't lying awake, anxiously wishing they could fall back asleep. Instead, they got up and talked with family members, prayed or meditated, had sex, smoked pipes, visited neighbors, or checked on their livestock. Some people use this window for quiet reflection or creative thinking, and there are historical records of individuals deliberately using this time for solving problems, writing, or engaging in the sort of deep thought that busy daylight hours simply didn't allow for. Historical and medieval texts casually reference first sleep and second sleep as though no explanation were needed. Because none was, everyone understood these terms since everyone experienced this pattern firsthand. It wasn't until gaslighting emerged in the early 19th century, followed by electric lighting later that century, that nighttime became fully controllable and artificial. Compressing this natural two-part sleep pattern into the single consolidated 8-hour block we now think of as biologically standard. But that assumption may not actually be accurate. If you've ever woken up around 2 in the morning, lain there feeling strangely alert and calm, and wondered if something was wrong with you, the answer might genuinely be nothing. Your body may simply be following patterns that human bodies followed for hundreds of thousands of years. You're just missing the campfire, the quiet voices of family nearby, and the truly profound darkness of a world without artificial lighting. One of the most stubborn misconceptions about prehistoric humans involves assuming their technology was crude and unsophisticated, that the term Stone Age implies something simple. But the skill required to produce their tools, clothing, shelter, and artwork was anything but basic. It was demanding, refined work requiring years of practice to master. Consider flint knapping, the technique of shaping stone, like flint or obsidian, through carefully controlled strikes to create a blade with a sharp, even edge. This might sound like something anyone could figure out with a rock, but that's not the case at all. The material has particular fracture characteristics that must be thoroughly understood in advance. Every strike requires precise control over angle, force, and placement, and a single mistake can destroy the entire piece. Modern archaeologists and hobbyists who have attempted to learn flint knapping report that true proficiency demands years of consistent practice. Ancient humans invested considerable time developing and maintaining this particular skill set. Then there's clothing production for cold environments, which represented an enormous undertaking in itself. Preparing animal hides for wear involved scraping them clean, treating them to prevent decay and stiffening, then stitching them into wearable garments using needles carved from bone. We've discovered bone needles dating back over 50,000 years. Needles featuring tiny eyes that someone painstakingly drilled through using nothing but stone tools, simply because they wanted properly sewn clothing, because the quality of their stitching genuinely mattered to them, because they cared about craftsmanship. And then there's their artwork, which deserves a moment of genuine appreciation. The cave paintings at Lascaux in France date back approximately 17,000 years, while those found at Chauvet-Pont d'Arc are potentially as old as 36,000 years. These aren't crude scratches or simple doodles. They're sophisticated, dynamic compositions depicting animals with real thoughtfulness. Horses captured mid-gallop, bison with heads turned, charging rhinoceroses, and lions hunting together in coordinated packs. These works demonstrate genuine understanding of movement, perspective, light, and shadow that continues to astonish professional artists and illustrators who study them today. Some artists incorporated the natural curves and bumps of the cave walls into their designs, giving animals a three-dimensional appearance, so that when viewed under flickering firelight, the only lighting they had available, the horses, bison, and wild cattle, would seem to breathe and shift and move. They essentially built cinematic illusions into solid rock, in total darkness, 36,000 years ago. That's not primitive craftsmanship. That's genuinely remarkable achievement. It means someone spent hours crouched or lying on their back on a cold cave floor, working not out of necessity, not because it provided food, but because they had something meaningful to express and found a way to communicate it through a medium that would outlast everything else they ever created by tens of thousands of years. If there's a definition of art anywhere, this qualifies. They also played seriously and with real enthusiasm, which makes complete sense because play isn't some modern indulgence. It's a defining trait among intelligent social species. Crows play, dolphins play, wolves play, and humans, who combine traits of all these species and more, play constantly and in elaborate ways. Evidence of organized board games stretches back to humanity's earliest civilizations. The royal game of Uar, discovered in ancient Mesopotamia, dates to roughly 2500 BCE, with its rules partially reconstructed from a surviving Babylonian clay tablet. But organized play almost certainly existed long before any formal civilization emerged. Children in every hunter-gatherer society ever studied engage in complex, rich play, imitating adult activities, creating their own rules and games, competing, cooperating, and negotiating with one another. This behavior appears consistently across every human culture ever observed, and such universal behavior patterns typically point toward deep evolutionary roots. Wrestling matches, foot races, and accuracy contests with thrown objects appear independently across ancient cultures worldwide, even among groups that had zero contact with one another, providing strong evidence that competitive play is simply a natural human behavior that emerges whenever people have available time and energy, which ancient humans, working just 3 to 5 hours daily, certainly had. Play also serves as one of the primary vehicles through which children develop physical abilities, social competence, and emotional maturity. In ancient societies, there was essentially no meaningful separation between play and education. Hunting skills were learned by playing at hunting. Social negotiation was learned by playing games involving genuine stakes and real conflict. Emotional regulation under pressure was learned through competition, including experiencing loss. Ancient children weren't sitting in classrooms. They were out in the world, and the world itself served as their teacher. They also took remarkable care of one another, which is perhaps the most striking detail of all, and one that gets far too little attention in mainstream discussions of prehistoric life. We've discovered skeletal remains of ancient individuals with severe, lifelong disabilities, conditions that would have made contributing to group survival in any conventional physical sense essentially impossible. Yet these individuals survived for years, sometimes decades, because other people cared for them. Consider the Neanderthal remains found at Shanidar Cave in Iraq, known as Shanidar I, who had a withered, amputated right arm, partial blindness in his left eye, significant hearing loss, and had survived serious leg injuries. He lived to roughly 40 years old, which was genuinely elderly for that era. He couldn't have hunted effectively or gathered food on his own, and by any coldly calculated survival logic, he would have been a burden on the group. Yet his community fed him, protected him, and kept him alive for years, not out of obligation, but by choice. We've also found the skull of a child with Down syndrome, who lived in what is now Spain, roughly 500,000 years ago, and survived to around 8 years of age. The level of sustained care required to keep a child with significant developmental challenges alive in that environment for 8 years far exceeds anything basic survival instinct alone would explain. Someone cared for that child enough to make it possible. We've discovered ancient skeletons showing healed fractures, meaning these individuals survived long enough for broken bones to fully mend, which means they were fed and protected throughout weeks or months of being unable to care for themselves. Someone stayed with them, brought them food, and kept the fire burning. Ancient humans buried their dead deliberately, with careful arrangement, grave goods, and evident ceremony. They grieved. They remembered their dead. They treated the end of a life as something significant and worth marking. The skeletal evidence from ancient people doesn't paint a picture of harsh indifference toward one another. It tells a story of communities that cared for each other at real cost to themselves, for no practical strategic benefit, simply because that's part of what it means to be human. And yes, they hunted too, and their hunting methods were genuinely astonishing. We can't cover this topic properly without addressing hunting, because it represents one of the most extraordinary physical accomplishments found anywhere in the natural world. Before bow and arrow technology developed, which appeared roughly 70,000 years ago in South Africa and considerably later elsewhere, humans hunted primarily using spears, combined with a strategy that sounds almost absurd when you first hear about it. It's called persistence hunting, and it's exactly what the name suggests. You identify a large animal, perhaps a kudu, wildebeest, or deer, and then you follow it, not by sprinting, since you couldn't outrun a wildebeest in a straight sprint anyway, but by maintaining a steady pace, tracking it, jogging after it through the hottest part of the day for hours on end. Every time the animal tries to rest, since most four-legged animals cool themselves by panting, which requires them to stop moving, you reappear on the horizon, causing it to panic and run again. You keep following for 5 hours, 8 hours, sometimes even longer, until the animal becomes so overheated and physiologically exhausted that it literally collapses and can't get back up. Then you simply walk over and finish the job. This strategy works because humans sweat. We're among the only mammals on Earth that cool our bodies primarily through perspiration rather than panting, which allows us to keep moving in heat conditions that would incapacitate nearly every other animal. Our unusual bodies, hairless, sweaty, flat-footed, with prominent buttocks, were specifically shaped by evolution for sustained long-distance running in hot climates. The gluteus maximus, the large muscle forming most of your backside, is dramatically larger in humans compared to other primates. Not because we spend time sitting, but because we run. It's fundamentally a running muscle that evolved specifically for this purpose. Our unusually flat feet are running adaptations. Our comparatively long legs, relative to our torso, are running adaptations. The way our heads balance on our spines with minimal muscular effort, preventing violent bobbing while running, is a running adaptation. Our ability to breathe independently of our stride, unlike most four-legged animals whose breathing must sync with their gait, is a running adaptation. We were essentially engineered from the ground up to be endurance predators, long-distance pursuit hunters, arguably the most improbable and effective ones on the planet. So when you're running a half marathon and questioning your life choices around mile 9, you're using biological hardware that evolution spent millions of years perfecting specifically for chasing large animals across open terrain in midday heat. You were genuinely built for this kind of endurance. Your ancestors were remarkably skilled at exactly this. Now, let's talk about genuine rest and downtime. Because here's something most people don't expect. Ancient humans were likely far better at truly resting than modern people are today. This isn't just about sleeping more or differently. It's about genuine rest, cognitively and emotionally, in ways that modern humans have largely forgotten how to achieve. Neuroscience has identified something called the default mode network, a collection of brain regions that activate specifically when you aren't focused on any particular external task. When your attention turns inward rather than outward. This network is linked to daydreaming, self-reflection, creative thinking, emotional processing, and what researchers term mental time travel, the capacity to mentally revisit past experiences and imagine future possibilities. This network is crucial for psychological well-being and creativity. But here's the catch. The default mode network requires genuine cognitive rest in order to properly activate. Modern humans, however, fill nearly every quiet moment with stimulation, whether that's a podcast, social media scrolling, something to watch, something to read, or a notification demanding attention. We've essentially, and largely accidentally, created an environment where achieving genuine cognitive rest requires deliberate, conscious effort just to happen at all. Ancient humans faced no such obstacle. Sitting by a fire after dark, simply watching the flames without any particular agenda, letting thoughts drift in and out freely, was completely normal. It was the standard evening activity throughout most of human history. This practice likely offered substantial benefits for mental health, emotional regulation, creative thinking, and the kind of unconscious problem-solving that our brains naturally engage in when given sufficient space to do so. There's a reason many of humanity's greatest breakthroughs in art, philosophy, mathematics, and technology tend to cluster around periods and places characterized by relative calm and contemplation. When the mind is genuinely unoccupied, it does remarkable things, and ancient people understood this, not through neuroscience, but through direct lived experience. They spent hours every single day simply sitting with their own thoughts, noticing details, making connections, and asking questions without obvious answers. The stories they told each other around the fire, about why stars moved across the sky, about where the dead went, about what animals symbolized, about how the world came into being. Those stories became the foundation for science, philosophy, religion, and literature as we know them today. They emerged from minds that had genuine time to wander and wonder. So here's one final question worth considering. Would you actually want to go back to that kind of existence? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you soon.